Welcome back to another episode of the Mainly Hoops podcast. Back with another Big East team preview here today. We got the DePaul Blue Demons, coming off Chris Holtman's first year there, 14-20 last year. Year before that, obviously, they were one of the worst teams college basketball had maybe ever seen. 0-20 in conference, 3-29 in overall. Last year, at least won 4 conference games. So I forget what the statistic was, but it was their first conference win in, what was it, 2 calendar years almost or something like that?
I think so. I think it was like a year and a half or something like that.
Yeah.
But
So,
I think they're in a better direction now.
At least headed in the right direction. Chris Holtman obviously has led a good program before. So trending a little bit in the right direction. But before we dive into DePaul for this upcoming year, if you have been liking the content, please go ahead and like and subscribe. We do appreciate all the support. But diving in, DePaul offensively first. Cody, what are your thoughts on this DePaul team's offense?
Yeah, I think their main strength is floor spacing, which is pretty typical for Chris Holtman teams. He always kind of emphasized that at Ohio State too, and that's been carried on by Jake Diebler there. But they have pieces like C.J. Gunn, R.J. Smith, Caleb Banks, and Brandon Macklin, plus some international recruits and like Ilya Miliusevich and Lucas Satori, who they're known as plus shooters as well. I think all these guys are mostly off-ball shooting options. I mean, maybe a guy like C.J. Gunn can create his own shot off the bounce or on the move, but I think they've all shown an ability to provide some secondary shot creation as well. I think Caleb Banks's floor spacing is especially important at the four position, because it'll open up the floor for guys like Layden Blocker, who's coming back and playing the point, who's more of a downhill driver. And then, as I mentioned, C.J. Gunn can put it on the floor and make a play. And I think N.J. Benson as a role man, I think he's a pretty underrated player across this conference, undersized big, but I think he has some versatility to his game. I think he can sort of be the beneficiary of this floor spacing. And I just think Chris Holtman knows how to construct a roster from an offensive perspective. Like, he's proven that at Ohio State, and he just recruits floor spacers who, are capable of making plays in secondary actions. So there's a lot of guys coming in that can all play off of one another pretty seamlessly. It's not overwhelming talent, but I do think these pieces can elevate one another with their more flexible skill sets. Holtman has had 10 straight finishes on offense inside the top 90 in adjusted offensive efficiency. Before last season at DePaul, he finished 126th. I think this roster, I think it's fair to say it's a little more talented than last season's. And 7 of those offenses at Ohio State finished in the top 25 out of the 10 that finished in the top 90. So I think his roster construction and his ability to bring in competent shooting always brings a high floor to his rosters.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think like you said, this team has a little bit more talent, and we kind of saw down the stretch of last season, even like DePaul was playing better even with what they had last year. So I think, like, especially for the guys that are returning, I think there could be the potential for like some added confidence from how last season closed. Like, yes, they blew that game. What was it, against Creighton in double overtime in the conference tournament? They had that game. They had that game won several times, and like Creighton tried to give it to DePaul, and what was it, Zugic, I think, that hit a few big shots down the stretch for Creighton. But they closed out 3 wins, and then that loss to Creighton by 4 in double overtime. So they were kind of trending in the right direction as they closed up the season. And now, like, some guys out, some guys in. I think this offense is better. I think this floor spacing, like you said, has upside. I think like C.J. Gunn's kind of an intriguing piece, I think, because he's a bigger sort of guard wing. He's at 6'7", but really good athlete. I think he's got some some shooting upside, right? I mean, I know he only shot at 30% last year, But I think with a little bit more of added talent to this roster, it's going to help him out a little bit. I think even a guy like RJ Smith is intriguing coming from Colorado. I think he's going to be very important to this team as probably like what figures to be their best shooter off the ball, right? He was 39% last year. Small sample size the year before as a freshman, but 45%. I think he's going to be a really important piece to the success of this offense and the overall floor spacing. And then you mentioned a guy like Caleb Banks at 6'8", coming from Tulane, who has the ability to shoot the ball a little bit, 33% on high volume, but at 6'8", also, has some interior scoring traits and upside. So I think it's intriguing. He can get to the line a little bit. I just think this team in general is a little bit stronger on the offensive end than last year. And I think like Chris Holtman is only going to help that a little bit of added talent. And like, while you said it's still not going to jump off the page to you as like, whoa, this DePaul team is uber talented. It is better considering it being DePaul.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. The talent is definitely a little bit higher. I mean, losing Amsil Delic for the season, like he's coming from Pittsburgh, I think he would have been a nice piece to kind of to slide in there, and that's like a little bit of a concern I have here in a couple minutes with their ball handling. But overall, I think they got a little bit more dynamic. I think they got a little bit more athletic, and I think Caleb Banks helps there a lot.
Yeah. You mentioned, now shifting to weaknesses, you mentioned their ball handling, right? And I think that's certainly like the concern for me that jumps off the page, at least, right? You're looking at like Layden Blocker, who's going to play the point. He was fine last year, right? 24% assist rate, 18% turnover rate. Didn't kill them, but kind of like outside of him as like primary ball handlers behind him, and then like secondary ball handlers, like I don't really know where they turn, right? I mean, CJ Gunn maybe a little bit as a bigger wing guard, and then like RJ Smith, I don't really like on the ball all that much, right? He turns the ball over at a pretty high clip. I think he was 22% turnover rate last year. The overall like guard depth and I guess just like guard creation depth isn't overly strong for this DePaul team.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. That was my main concern. And I think Layden Blocker projects as like the only on-ball guard that we can really trust. And like you mentioned, like most of these guys are secondary action players who need advantages created for them at times. And I think Blocker is extremely important there, but I think you would need another guy to really help you out. I think a guy like Miljasevic maybe has the upside to do it. We haven't seen him at this level. And from what I watch from him, he's just more of a secondary action guy as well. And he kind of struggles to create advantages off the bounce. And he's a little bit smaller, thin frame. So I don't really see that working right away. And you mentioned RJ Smith is going to play a role as an off-ball shooter, but he had a 22% turnover rate last season. He has a 22% turnover rate for his career. I do like him as a shooter. I think he's got a super quick trigger with some range, but just has some deficiencies in his game. And I do think these guards putting pressure on the rim is going to be a concern as well. And like Blocker, again, is going to be the only guy that can really do that from the wing. But just the lack of burst from the rest of the perimeter group, plus like a lack of high level interior scoring. Like Benson he plays bigger than his 6'8" frame, but I don't think he's a guy that you can trust when you give him the ball on the low block, even with the floor being super spaced. And I just don't trust him to make high level decisions as a short roller. I think he can score as a short roll man, but I think when the defense collapses on him, I think he could struggle a little bit. But so, I mean, I still think this is a roster that I don't think it can, like the bottom can fall out, but I just don't think there's a super high ceiling because of the lack of creation across the board.
Yeah, no. And I think one thing I didn't mention in my strengths that I had jotted down is like and I'm curious your thoughts on this, but do you think like this team, I feel like can get on the offensive glass a little bit? Like while they are a little bit undersized on the front line, like I think guys like Benson, Banks, like even CJ Gunn is kind of a bigger wing, have shown some ability to get on the glass, and then we don't really know, what the roles of some of the other like deeper bench guys coming in are going to play. But I think it could be an area where they could have some success, I think, on the offensive end to make up for some of the talent.
Yeah, I think Benson will have the most impact. I mean, he had a 10.4% offensive rebound rate and played about half the minutes last season. And Banks will help out a little bit. I think he's going to be more on the floor as a floor spacer. And like you mentioned, I think it's going to come down to these depth guys like Isaiah Medina, the 3-star Kaman Maker, who was at St. John's last year and didn't really play at all. Theo, Pierre, Justin as well. It's just not completely sure how well these guys fit in scheme wise, because I think Holtman likes having skill at all 5 positions, and I'm not sure those 3 big men are going to be able to like make any sort of decisions with the ball in their hands or even like space it at all. So I'm just not sure what their roles are going to be, which I would consider them closer to average on the offensive glass. I think it'll depend on what Holtman wants to emphasize, but I think if there's enough shooting on this roster, I don't really think they have to emphasize getting second chances all that much.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Now, shifting to the defensive side, I think this defensive unit does have some upside with guys that can make plays, and also like despite having a smaller front court at like 6'8" in Benson, 6'8" in Banks, both have shown kind of the ability to protect the rim a little bit. Both are right around 5% or 5-6% block rates. And even Banks last year in 6 top 100 games, his block rate was, right around 4%, 5% overall. So I think they have some upside to make plays on the defensive end. And then a guy like CJ Gunn, who I think like is a solid defender, created plenty of opportunities in steals, and also had a 1.5% block rate last year as well. So I think the defensive unit could be okay.
Yeah, I would agree. I think they just have some solid pieces on this roster. I think Layden Blocker and NJ Benson are probably the best defenders that I've watched. I mean, Blocker on the ball is pretty damn good. He's going to take responsibility guarding the opposing team's point guard every night, and I think he can do a really nice job of taking teams out of their offense. And then Caleb Banks and RJ Smith are pretty solid as well. Like Banks played in that 2-lane zone last year, so I'm not completely sure what he's going to provide on the ball consistently, guarding more perimeter oriented fours. I don't think he's like a fantastic lateral mover, but he has length, and 4.8% block rate last season is nothing to just turn your head to. And from what I watched from RJ Smith, I think he's a rather impressive on-ball defender. And he only had a 1.9% steal rate, but he moves his feet extremely well and contests shots really well. I think he's going to fit in here just fine. I mean, Holtman's defenses will emphasize guarding in space a little bit, and I think they have some guys that can absolutely do that. I mean, we'll see what how much NJ Benson plays at the 5. I mean, I think that's really the only position he can play, and just handling, a lot of the rim protection responsibilities when Banks isn't on the floor could be a concern. But like I said, he plays much bigger than his 6'8" frame, 6.5% block rate, 23% defensive rebound rate, and his 44% minute share. It's just a matter of if he's going to play 60 to 70% of the minutes, like does his value dip a little bit? But besides that, I actually think they have some pretty solid pieces on this roster, at least in the projected starting lineup.
Yeah, and I think also like not so much a strength, but like there's some intrigue, I think, on the bench and some of these guys that are coming in that we don't really know a lot about, right? Like Kaman Maker projects, like Torvik projects him at a 6.5% block rate. He's 7'1", something you can't really teach. Medina, we don't really know. He's 7'1". So a couple of guys, like depending on what we see in like Benson's minutes jump this year. Couple guys that could potentially fill a role as, bigger rim protectors that can come in off the bench, but we don't really know yet, right? It's something that's a bit uncertain, which kind of like leads me into a weakness or an area of concern, at least on the defensive end, is like I do worry a little bit about the depth, just uncertain depth at this point, right? It's hard knowing, but kind of similarly to how we viewed like the offensive side of the ball, there's not a ton of like wing guard depth on the defensive end, right? We kind of know what we're getting in the offensive or in the starting group, right? With guys like Gunn, Blocker, Smith. But then after that, like Miljasevic coming off the bench, Brandon Macklin. But then it's a lot of like, they have a lot of bigs kind of on the bench, but the guard depth overall on the defensive end is something I worry a little bit about.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. That was my main concern was rim protection depth, because we don't know what we're going to get from Maker or Medina or any of the other depth options, and it's going to put a lot of pressure on Benson to be really good for 25, possibly 30 minutes. And another concern I had was I just don't think this defense is going to really move the needle in any area. I know there are some guys that can make plays on their own. Like there's some turnover upside there. It's just something that Holtman's never really emphasized. He emphasizes just having balance across the board, and it's just not necessarily gonna move the needle anywhere. I think they're gonna be closer to average on the D glass. I think like obviously there's turnover forcing upside with those guys, but I don't think it's going to be a high pressure scheme that is going to make them a top 50 turnover rate team or anything like that. But overall, I still think the roster from a defensive standpoint is much better than last year. I think they had a lot of like smaller guards that, were more offensive minded, like guys like Jacob Meyer, David Thomas, and, Isaiah Rivera, guys like that. Like they didn't bring any physicality to the wings. And I think they have a little bit more of that this year.
Yeah, no, that's definitely fair. I just think this, like we talked about at the start, like this roster just has a bit more, and I think provides it with a little bit more upside than we saw in last year's like 4-16 iteration of DePaul. And I think the longer Chris Holtmann is there, depending on how long that is, we'll see growth in this program. I think like he's gotten better in other places, and I think that won't be any different here, especially in a Big East league that isn't necessarily the best this year outside of the top. So, I think it remains to be seen, and we'll see what this team can bring, because it's kind of a wide open league right after UConn and St. John's. It's a bit more hazy this year.
For sure. Yeah. There's going to be one team that emerges that, who's projected to be in that 8 through 11 range, just because somebody has to in this league.
Right.
It feels like there's a lot of unknown, and I think DePaul, with the offensive skill that they have potential to get themselves into the conversation. It's just maybe their ceiling's a little bit capped with the lack of on-ball talent, I guess.
Right. Yeah. All right. So now looking at some awards for the team MVP, team X Factor. Who do you have here?
I went with Layden Blocker as my MVP. I think he's going to be the guy that, kind of connects all of the pieces for this team, really on both ends, as a driver, as a passer, as a pick and roll operator, operating in the transition game. I think he likes to get out and run a little bit more often than Holtmann teams do. But yeah, I think he's going to be the guy that's setting up these shooters consistently. And I think he's probably one of the best guard defenders in this league. He was known for his defensive prowess coming into college, at Arkansas, and then eventually, made his way over to DePaul, and he's shined in a scheme that doesn't emphasize high pressure, and I think he's kind of stood out. So yeah, I went with him as my MVP. X Factor, I went with NJ Benson. I just think he's going to have a ton of pressure on him, defending at the rim and even providing rim scoring when the floor is so spaced. Like he's going to have to execute in one-on-one opportunities, as a short roll man. So I think he's more of like a swing piece than an X factor. I know those things kind of go hand in hand, but I do think with it's going to be interesting to see if he can maintain the same, per minute value that he does with a higher share.
Yeah, no, it's definitely fair, especially with the uncertainty in the depth pieces in the front court, right? If someone emerges, one of those guys, one of the freshmen, one of the transfers, then some pressure gets relieved off of him for sure. For me, I actually went a different direction in both awards. My MVP, I went with CJ Gunn. Last year averaged like 13 points. I think he has a little bit more upside as a shooter than he showed last year. We saw him at Indiana 2 years ago shoot at 34%. He was 39% in top 50 games. So I think there's some upside there. I think he provides some value in transition, some value as a driver that hasn't really been tapped into as much. And then on the defensive end, I think he has the ability to create some plays. He has a career 3.3% steal rate, 1.5% block rate. I think there's some upside there. And I think he can really tap into that. And I think he will. And then in terms of X factor, I went with RJ Smith. Just as like a steadying floor spacing piece, right? I think he's their best shooter. And I think if he can provide that for this team, it's going to make everyone's life a little bit easier, right? We talked about the floor spacing being a plus, but a lot of these guys, right, are like, they're solid shooters, but they're not, elite level shooters. I think RJ Smith has that upside to be in that 38-39% range and really be a plus shooter for this team, especially where they lack a little bit of guard creation, particularly depth-wise. So ultimately, I went there. I think he can also provide some defensive strengths, as we touched on. So that's why I went there. But Benson, I think for sure is just as important, right? There are a lot of important pieces to the success of this team.
For sure, yeah. And if RJ Smith can play 27 or 28 minutes per game as opposed to his 22 last season, I think there's more upside for him to provide value as a shooter. He only averaged, what was it? He had three 3-point attempts per game, shot at 39% last year. And if he can get that up to 5 or 6 attempts, I think he's going to get more open opportunities. That Colorado offense was kind of a mess last season. So with better floor spacers around him, I think he's going to receive more opportunities, and I think there's definitely more upside there. And he's a solid two-way player. So yeah, I don't mind that.
Yeah. Now, before we wrap things up, ceiling and floor for this team, and then one bold prediction.
Yeah, I had my ceiling as 7th or 8th in the Big East. I still think they're just a bit behind the rest of the league from a talent perspective. And, 7th or 8th in the Big East is another step in the right direction for this program and for where they were at. They finished 4-16 last year and 113th in Torvik after where did they finish the year before that? Like 200th or something like that. So I think they're taking steps in the right direction. I think there's a real chance that they finish inside the top 100 nationally on Ken Pop or Torvik or wherever you look. But the floor, I did make it the bottom. There's just a lot of teams in this league that could realistically finish at the bottom. And like I said, I just think there's, just a lack of talent and depth compared to some of the, upper echelon teams in this league. So yeah, finishing last is it's a real possibility.
Yeah. I think for me, I had them at the bottom finishing 10th. I think we touched on Seton Hall last week. I don't want to say that this team's certainly better, but I expect it to be better. So I guess there is a world where they could finish worse and be the bottom. But I think I prefer them at 10th at worst. And then I said 6th at the ceiling. Maybe they get some upside out of some of these newcomers that we don't really know a ton about, and they end up being a little bit better than we think, especially in a league where, like you said, someone's got to break out. Some team has got to finish kind of above expectation, and I think it could be this team. Just a lot of uncertainty with some of these pieces, so we'll see. But definitely still not a world beater by any means in the Big East. And then bold prediction, I said that CJ Gunn makes a leap and averages 16 a game. Last year, 12.9. This year, we see him make another leap, get to 16, maybe 17 if we want to get real freaky.
Yeah, I could definitely see it, but I went in another direction for my bold prediction. It's another player. I said NJ Benson can realistically average a double-double. I think at his peak, I think there's a chance that he makes, second team all Big East with, he played 21.9 minutes a game last year, had 9 points per game, 6.2 rebounds per game. If those depth pieces aren't going to play any sort of role, he's probably going to find a way to get to 30 minutes a game if he can stay out of foul trouble consistently. And I do think averaging 14 and 9, 14 and maybe even 10, because like he's a great two-way rebounder. I think there's a realistic possibility that he can do that and then make an all-conference team.
Yeah, I definitely don't hate that, especially with what's going to be on his plate. So, all right, that wraps things up for DePaul, but we'll see you next time on the Mainly Hoops podcast.